We'll see. I think there's going to be a fight for the soul of the Republican Party when Trump leaves office, or looking at the 2028 nomination, between the isolationists and those who really understand what Ronald Reagan talked about when he referred to peace through strength. I'd like to see, in building up public support, I'd like to see Vice President J.D. Vance make an ad with the following statement. I strongly support Donald Trump's effort to change the regime in Iran through the use of military force. This is J.D. Vance, and I approve this message. See how that does for him.
I'm John Pienaar, here with an hour of special coverage and discussion of the crisis in the Middle East. What is going on in the Middle East? What is going to go on in the Middle East? I ask this question because I, for one, have no clue what the answer may be. I'm not sure we're going to be very much wiser at the end of this hour, but that is the nature of the discussion and the nature of the crisis in the Middle East. What we can do and what we will do is talk about it, share some perspectives on it, some expert knowledge of it, and just explore some of the questions for you. And I hope hear your thoughts and some of your questions over the course of the next hour. Especially keen to hear that today. I'm always keen to hear that, to be honest, every single night that passes. It makes me, and just convinces me I'm not entirely alone in the studio with my two friends on Times Radio. We're going to start here with this recap of the coverage of the conflict on Iran here on Times Radio, starting with the news as it broke on Saturday.
Bring you this news, which has reached us in the last few minutes, that Israel says it has launched a preventative attack against Iran. Witnesses in Tehran say they heard an explosion, according to reports from Associated Press. Sirens are also sounding across Israel.
People are sitting tight and waiting for some kind of retaliation. Seeing images from Tehran showing smoke coming out of certain buildings, but it's not quite clear yet if this was done in coordination with the Americans or with their approval.
There were at least 3 explosions in Tehran near the offices of Ayatollah Khamenei.
The United States military is undertaking a massive and ongoing operation to prevent this very wicked, radical dictatorship from threatening America and our core national security interests.
I have a simple question. Does the United Kingdom support US and Israeli action in Iran or not?
We didn't participate in the strikes on Iran, but we share that primary aim that the US and allies across the region have.
Hazrat Ayatollah al-Uzma Sayyid Ali Husseini Khamenei.
If we didn't hit within 2 weeks, they would have had a nuclear weapon. If we didn't do the B-2 attack a number of months ago, they would have a nuclear weapon. And when crazy people have nuclear weapons, bad things happen.
Because I don't believe this will be finished quickly. And as it goes on, it will get dirtier and bigger and messier. And I'm sure we will be more involved with it.
By the way, I'm not happy with the UK either. This is not Winston Churchill that we're dealing with.
British jets are shooting down drones and missiles to protect American lives in the Middle East on our joint bases. That is the special relationship in action. Hanging on to President Trump's latest words is not the special relationship.
So echoes of this conflict from the beginning of the week when it moved to its present phase. Now, the UK Defence Secretary John Healey, he has been visiting Cyprus, and Larissa Brown, our defence editor at the Times, has been with him. She asked him if the RAF could directly target Iranian missile sites to protect British assets.
We're doing what Britain can do best. So we put the fast jets in here from January onwards, and also into Qatar. That was to play a leading part in coordinated regional defensive actions. From day one, we've been flying defensive sorties. We've been taking down drones, Jordan, Qatar, northern Iraq, and as circumstances in the conflict change, as it becomes clearer the threats that Iran poses, then we'll adapt the action we're taking, which is why we're sending anti-drone helicopters in. They'll start arriving from tonight. It's why we are sending in top air defence planners today arriving on the island, because we're starting to coordinate now the systems and ships that other nations are now also starting to put into the area.
Could we do those strikes against Iranian targets in Iran? Have you ruled it out?
We're playing the role that we can best play, and the role that we can best play was responding to the new request from the US on Saturday, when it became clear how indiscriminate, widespread and increasingly uncontrolled the Iranian strikes were. 10 countries that first day, hotels in Dubai and in Bahrain, Kuwait's national civilian airport. These weren't just military targets, it was widespread across the region.
So that was the Defence Secretary John Healey talking a short while ago in Cyprus to the Times Defence editor Larissa Brown, painstakingly giving an account of Britain's involvement so far, plans at this moment to protect assets in the Gulf and in Cyprus. And that's like screeching sound in the background was the sound of the Defence Secretary swerving very heavily the question of what he might do next and what this country might do next. Joining us in the studio, Catherine Philp, the World Affairs editor of The Times. Hi to you, Catherine.
Hi, John.
Lovely to see you. And Manveen Rana here, the host of The Story podcast. Lovely to see you, Manveen.
Hello.
I want to start the way I sometimes like doing, by asking you an introductory question to which there is simply no right answer. So, Catherine, the Iraq War, which we remember, it changed the politics of the region and the world over 20 years ago. Are we looking at a war here in Iran which is capable of doing the same thing?
Yes, absolutely. Not just what's happening now, but what started really on October 7th and has led into a campaign led chiefly by Israel to remake the Middle East and completely change it. And I think going back to Iraq, we could also say that we wouldn't be here today had that not happened, because the removal of Saddam Hussein took away the main bulwark in the region against Iran. And when Saddam Hussein was being interrogated by the FBI, when he was in captivity before he was tried and hanged in Baghdad, he was asked, why did you pretend to have, why did you let us think you had weapons of mass destruction? Why didn't you just say you didn't? He said, well, because of Iran. And he told his interrogator, just you wait, you'll see.
Yes, and on that, Manveen, when you look at what happened in 2020, in 2003, and the war in Iraq, and the lessons that follow from that conflict, we hear the Prime Minister Keir Starmer saying now, look, he's learned the lessons of that conflict, and they were twofold, two that he picks on. One is the inadvisability of going to war without a clear plan, and the other is the lack of sense in principle of going into a war that doesn't have legal legitimacy.
Yeah, which seems fair enough. I'm not sure many lessons have been learnt across the board, though. I mean, America is still struggling to vocalise what the next day planning is for this. You know, there was that great moment where Donald Trump stood up and said the operation had been such a success, they'd somehow killed the number 2 and number 3 leaders they were hoping to line up for it, which sort of rather seems like a war on words. I'm not sure how you define success in that particular way. I think one of the lessons we don't learn enough from all of these interventions, whether it's Iraq or Libya, is that every time you go into a country like this and lead to regime change, you are setting off thousands of ripple effects that you can't begin to anticipate. So all the stuff about we've modelled this, it'll be a few weeks' time, I find laughable. You know, with Libya, we didn't understand what it would do to migration patterns. We didn't understand what it would do to Islamic militias across the Maghreb. You know, there are huge impacts of every one of these moments that we, what this has meant for Iran. You know, the Iraq War was the moment that led to the Shia crescent really flourishing across the region. This now is the moment where that is in peril, where that is at threat. And this, some people would say that's a natural rebalancing, a reordering. They've had 2 decades of having an inordinate amount of power in the region. On the other hand, one of the other lessons from Iraq, actually, that I feel like we never learn is that we look at this as if it's a game of risk. You know, we talk geopolitics, we look at the map, we move pieces around. We only belatedly ever look at the on-the-ground dynamics, at the religious dynamics, at the sects. I think we failed completely to talk about the fact that a lot of people will see this as a war on the Shia. Yeah. And, that is a sect that is built on a sense of grievance. They will see all of Iran's proxies being attacked at the same time. They have been over the last 2 years, as Catherine says, since October 7th, really. They will see all of that as an attack on the Shia, and that's something we're not even thinking about. And so I don't think we begin to anticipate how all of this will unfold, because we're only looking at part of the board.
Yes.
And I think we're also looking at the very swift chaos in the region that has unfolded because of Iran lashing out and sending missiles in every direction to every neighbour. But just as you introduced that idea, we don't know what this is going to kick off with Shia communities all across the region, not just proxies, but how they will feel about this and whether they will feel. I mean, the other thing, just before I came into the studio, I heard that the Iranians have managed to send a missile into Azerbaijan. Well, that seems very unwise, because one of the, I think the largest ethnic minority in Iran is the Azeris, and they form actually an outsized role in the Iranian military and security establishment extraordinarily. So, whilst Donald Trump and Israel think that they can foment a Kurdish uprising by sending people across the border from Iraq and giving them weapons to a group of people who make up 10% of the population, there's suddenly an ethnic crisis, unfolding that I don't know if Donald Trump's ever heard of an Azeri.
And I think he mispronounced them.
Did he mention them though?
Azerbaijan, I think he called them.
Yes. He knows the country, but does he know that the group is in Iran? I don't think he does.
But it's also actually that is also the start of, this gets murkier and murkier. The war on information has already begun. So it was very interesting that drone on Azerbaijan. There was also some on Turkey today, and the Iranians have come out immediately denying responsibility, which they haven't done with any of the attacks on the Gulf, not even Oman, which is a great friend and a great ally. They've taken responsibility for those. These, they claim, are designed to create enemies where they weren't intending to.
One of many abiding memories of the Iraq War was the failure to anticipate and to calculate in advance, wasn't it? At the beginning, it seemed to be discussed as being a simple matter, that Saddam Hussein could be removed, and don't worry too much about the Kurds in the north or the Shia and the Sunni divisions, and that was just a notable failure of preparation before the war, let alone of how the war was conducted. So, isn't it then, as you say, it is pretty striking to see some of the administration toying with the idea of arming and facilitating different militia groups, including the Kurds, helping them cross the border into Iran, and then just whatever happens to go on. I want to talk more about that in just a minute. But against that background, Catherine and Manveen, so I've been reading today, I've been putting this to various of my guests today, I've been reading analysis out of Washington, very well-informed analysis, based on the evidence of what we've seen already, that President Trump is driving this whole process on his instincts. You could argue, although some might say it's a flippant way to describe it, on his whim, and he's watching his military advisors who are giving him advice, people like General Kane, who has critics as well as supporters. He is said to be giving him practical military advice, and there's the NSA, who in past times would have been a serious influence in planning a war. It seems to be about instinct now, and given the problems and the potential complications we've discussed already, I'm not sure that's really very reassuring.
It's not reassuring at all. I think it was in his first term that Donald Trump was asked, who do you consult on foreign policy? And he said, well, myself. And he did then have some informed, specialists, expert people within his circle. He doesn't have any now. His last Iran expert left last summer. So there's no one in his circle who is giving him good information. Now, if it were only his instincts, I think that would be concerning enough. But it's not just his. It's Benjamin Netanyahu's, who we learn has been driving a lot of this, including this effort to arm the Kurds that we were just talking about last night. The news started popping up that 10,000 Kurds had crossed the border. It turned out not to be true. The tweet came from an Israeli journalist, one of the ones who interviewed Trump today, Barak Ravid, and he deleted it. Now, there were all sorts of psyops going on here, and I think we talked about this yesterday, John, but the fact that wherever Trump's instincts and feelings take him, he's not sure of his goal, and Israel has different goals. So this is not a great way to even, as Manveen said, when you start a conflict like this, you unleash all these different possibilities and outcomes that you don't have control over. This is very unwise to believe that he is somehow of control. We see now today he wants to personally pick the supreme leader. He clearly doesn't want a supreme leader. He wants a leader, but he wants to pick it. How does he think that's going to go down amongst the Iranian people?
Well, he keeps on telling us that each successive choice of leader keeps getting inconveniently killed.
He does, but I can't actually work out who he thinks would have been the leader who's been killed. That's very confusing to me too.
Yeah,
I don't know what criteria he wants.
Matthew, thanks for writing in. Matthew makes this point. Why hasn't Starmer followed the same approach as Macron and Carney? He's an utter failure. I'm appalled to be British while watching a modern-day Chamberlain leaving us and our allies utterly defensive. Strong views from Matthew. Thanks for writing in, Matthew. I think we can take that on, and a lot else. And it's already very clear to me that an hour for this isn't even remotely enough for what we have to get through. Still, Catherine Philp, Manveen Rana will get as much in this time as we possibly can. This is a special programme here on Times Radio with me, John Pienaar, looking at the crisis, the conflict in the Middle East. So Manveen Rana is here, host of the Story podcast, and Catherine Philp, the World Affairs editor at The Times, for this hour of discussion, conversation, maybe addressing some of your thoughts. In fact, that's what I very much hope to do over the next hour. A. Neil, I don't think that's Andrew, but A. Neil has written in. He says, I don't see what benefit Starmer got from refusing the US to use the bases in the UK and Chagos, talking about Diego Garcia, regardless of whether the US have no viable endgame whatsoever. If the US are such amazing allies, why was there no need for the UK to talk about international law? It's clearly a red herring, says A. Neil, given there's no body to enforce it, and both the US and Israel are already on the wrong side of it. Well, that's a point. Catherine,
Are you sure that's not Andrew?
If you want to take that on.
I think it's very relevant, and it's very relevant because some of our listeners may have already watched the Tony Blair story currently running on Channel 4, which reviews some of the decisions in the Iraq War. And there were enormous mental gymnastics done over the legal rationale for that war. The Chilcot inquiry absolutely savaged Blair and his cabinet for essentially cooking up a questionable legal justification. And they rewrote the rule book then about how you draw up that advice. So once Starmer had received that advice, I wonder what the next inquiry would say if Starmer had ignored that advice. I think that he has gained something in that he only acted when the situation changed. And actually, he's kind of reminded Donald Trump and the Americans that they need Britain. And that's no bad thing.
Yes.
It's not a one-way relationship.
Yes. I mean, yes, he'd have no reason to be cross if the answer was always yes. Is what you're saying. But
also, remember, he doesn't think we did anything in Afghanistan where we lost 457 troops.
Yes. Well, yes, we do remember that.
Also, I mean, it's up to us to try and prop up what's left of the rules-based system. America is very happy tearing it up, but, as Mark Carney pointed out, we are effectively the middle powers who are entirely protected by it, which is why it's so much in our interest to try and keep to international law, to try and keep that system going. The moment we abandon it, for us, I think all hope is lost.
And Carney himself, who at first supported Trump, rode that back quite considerably. And I was corresponding with someone in his circle, and I said, well, it must be easy for you with no imperial era bases around the world to have to decide whether to give him or not. That was rhetoric. Britain was in a very different place where we risked being dragged into something right from the outset without a good reason. Now the reasoning has changed.
And Charles writes in. Charles, thank you. Charles writes in. He says, I'm not a natural supporter of Keir Starmer, but support his reluctance and caution. Let's spend more on domestic social issues and less on protecting a false strength. Well, Charles, thank you for that. But is that a false choice? And do you get to choose between domestic priorities and matters abroad, including region-changing, world-changing events where you do have a particular interest?
Oh, you don't get to choose, but if it's a war of choice, that is the only opportunity you actually have to be able
at Britain's position within
to set a mark.
And the Prime Minister insists that he was reluctant at the outset, and then afterwards he argues it's not accepted by everyone, wasn't accepted by Lord Dannatt a moment ago, and certainly not by the American Washington players that I spoke to either. But he says, look, he didn't want to go there, didn't want to back a war which he wasn't remotely sure about. But afterwards, it was a different kettle of fish and there wasn't a choice. Charles suggests that why are we getting involved and why are we talking about the things that matter to us at home on the high street?
So, the danger of allowing America to use the bases straight away would have been that we made ourselves a target. It turned out, quite by chance, we made ourselves a target anyway. They already attacked Cyprus, and that gave us a reason to go in because we were being attacked. This is a defensive war for us in as much as we are involved. That's a very different matter. If we had ended up, if we'd allowed America to use those bases, we would have given Iran a justification to attack us in a far greater capacity, I imagine. Like a couple of drones to Cyprus would not have been it. Just look at what's happening to the neighbourhood. Look at what's happened to Bahrain because they house the Fifth Fleet. We would have been seen as complicit in the way that those Gulf bases are, and they are under serious attack. So I think it is entirely because you're thinking about your domestic problems. You don't want to engage in a war of your choosing, which is bound to be expensive, lengthy, and you won't have any say over. We were talking about Donald Trump and his reasoning earlier. He is a very intuitive politician. He makes these huge sweeping policies and statements, and he always has that taco option of seeing everything fall apart and then backing out. I'm slightly afraid that he sees this war in the same way. The thing with a war of choices, you can choose when and how you go into it. You can't choose when and how you come out of it. Right. You can't just turn around tomorrow and say, I'm done now. I feel like that was a success. We're walking away.
You know what? He actually could do that. I mean, it wouldn't go how he wants it to, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Oh, I think he'll try, but I don't think he's understood that war isn't the same as other policies.
Yeah, you may lose interest in war, but it doesn't lose interest in you.
You can't influence the other side.
Right, there's far too much agreement in this studio. we do not want perfect consensus at any given moment. If you want to just argue with Manveen, if you want to argue with Catherine, I want you to do that.
We'll find something.
Yeah, look, send me a text, 87222, tell me what you were thinking. I want to, just before we hear the news, I just want to put another big picture thought to you. We are and have seen the Trump administration pretty much abandoning any interpretation of his America First agenda as being in any way isolationist, because what we're seeing now is global interventionism under the same label, and the rest of the world, including us here in Britain and in Europe, are scrambling to find its feet, and that's another historic shift.
Indeed. I mean, I don't think he was ever a true isolationist. I think it's
I'd
just
agree.
Desperate. So, stop agreeing with me
I'm
about
sorry.
me, honestly. I think that what has happened is he was trying to remake the Western Hemisphere, and he's become kind of high on the awesome power of the American military, and has decided that, he's got a hammer and everything looks like a nail.
Yeah. I also think we're so desperate to try and give some coherence to what is his foreign policy. Even he seemed surprised, to be honest, 2 months ago when he started talking about the Donroe Doctrine. He seemed delighted by the idea as if it had just occurred to him, which I suspect it had. I imagine somebody in the White House turned around and said, I know what we'll call it. That 2 months ago gave us a vision of the world which was all about spheres of influence in this great power competition. That gave him the Western Hemisphere. We could all panic about Greenland. We could see him acting in Venezuela. We could worry about where it would be next, Cuba, Mexico, what happens. But it would be the Western Hemisphere. The idea was that American wars in the Middle East were over. 2 months later, off he goes. I sort of think we're trying to give some great coherence. We're trying to decide this is about the Western Hemisphere. Whereas actually he is ultimately a very intuitive businessman. Somebody turns up to him, presents him with what looks like a half-decent deal. He won't necessarily think it through. He's in because he feels like it makes sense. And then he'll try and add the theory afterwards, which is what this feels like, because every day we're hearing a slightly different explanation from the White House and from the Pentagon about the reasons for this war and about what the end game is.
All right, now listener has called in. He is Johnny Gray, and he also happens to have been a former commanding officer at the Argyll Regiment, and he is not impressed with the pace and the scale of Britain's involvement in this conflict behind the Americans. We can hear Johnny Gray's, Colonel Gray's thoughts on that in just a moment, and we're also going to be hearing from Sir John Sayers, the former head of the Secret Intelligence Service MI6, and from John Bolton, who did work with Donald Trump and is now very much not a supporter of Donald Trump. We'll hear from him. We can all talk to him. You can put your questions for him, and Catherine and Manveen can chip in with their questions to him as well. We've got so much to get through. About to hear then from John Sayers, who was very much instrumental in the working and the operation of the special relationship in so many roles for so many years. John, I think you can hear us, and more importantly, we can hear you. Evening to you.
Good evening, John.
Great to have you with us. Let me start with this. We are all really keen to just hear some thoughts from you and put a couple to you, John, and maybe one or two from our listeners too. I was just saying, you have been so enmeshed in the special relationship as ambassador, as head of the Secret Intelligence Service and other roles too. How serious for that relation do you think this latest falling out with the Prime Minister is? And I say this too, without wanting to sound like a party pooper. It is very well understood that the special relationship for a very long time has not been quite all it's cracked up to be.
Well, the special relationship is a term used more by the media than by professionals engaged in it. And it doesn't all hinge upon the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President. Obviously, there have been times in the past, Thatcher Reagan and Clinton Blair and Bush Blair, when it has been very close at the leadership level. But to be honest, John, the personal relationship has barely existed between presidents and prime ministers for the last almost 20 years. What is special about the relationship isn't about the political connections, it's about the defence and security and intelligence connections. It's about the nuclear relationship, it's about the integration of intelligence services, and it's about special forces and the navies who are very close to one another. So that's what is different. Yes. And in those areas, Britain still pulls its weight and contributes proportionately to what we can. Yeah. And I think that will survive this ruction at the top level.
Yeah, when you talk about the closeness of past relationships, I take it you're thinking of Tony Blair's close relationship with George W. Bush right after Bill Clinton. I also remember David Cameron going to watch basketball and eating a hot dog alongside Barack Obama. Maybe less warm now, but still, those things you mentioned, intelligence support, military cooperation, those things were true then and are true now.
Well, that's correct. That's why I say I think the core elements of the really deep relationship between the intelligence and defence communities on both sides of the Atlantic, that remains. Obviously, it's come under a bit of strain as the Americans have invested heavily in their own defence capabilities, and we have done less so in that front. Yeah. It's really important that we keep up with the Americans in all this. But I don't think the current spat between Trump and Starmer is going to be terminal for the relationship.
Well, unless you do consider that with President Trump, the personal and the political are absolutely intertwined. It might be harder for Keir Starmer to get President Trump to pick up the phone, let alone listen to what he has to say. Manveen Rana's here.
Hi, John. I just wanted to say, I often hear people say that the special relationship really exists at that institutional level. It's about defence and security links, and those don't change whoever's in power. I don't know if you heard Kate Borsay, who was in here a moment ago, but it does feel like in many ways those institutions are under assault in America at the moment, whether it's the military, which is going through huge cultural change. There are very senior level leadership is being sacked in many ways if they sort of stand up to any big changes. There are similar things happening in the intelligence community from what we hear. There are concerns about the people running some of these institutions. Does that have an impact on how we work with them?
Well, I think the events of the last 6 weeks or so will have re-established the support for the civilians in the Trump administration, for the military and for the intelligence community. You can question the wisdom of the abduction of President Maduro in Venezuela, or the launch of this assault on Iran, but you can't deny it's been incredibly effectively carried out by US forces and by the intelligence community. They've demonstrated that they have an extraordinary capacity to put together an intelligence picture using artificial intelligence, using all the data feeds, satellite feeds and so on, mobile phone signals. Even in Tehran, they hacked into the traffic cameras to detect where the president, the leadership, especially the supreme leader, was moving. I think President Trump has recognized just how incredibly professional these groups are, the defense agencies and the intelligence agencies. The danger is he becomes so enamored of them that he uses them rather liberally and rather excessively.
Although in the last week we have seen people who are high up in defence being sacked if they didn't agree with the plans for Iran, but also the announcement that apparently the military will no longer be able to attend Ivy League colleges, because why would you want smart people at leadership level coming up with military strategy? Actually,
the idea of using traffic cameras to track the movement of ultra-high level targets is I hadn't heard of that before. It's one of the benefits of talking to a spy master, I guess. Catherine Philp.
Hi, John. I wanted to ask you about Iraq. Pete Hegseth said the other day, rather stroppily, this isn't Iraq, it's not a forever war. And because, obviously, of your intimate knowledge of that conflict, do you think it is like Iraq or not?
Well, the big difference between Iraq 20 years ago and Iran now is there are no ground troops involved from the United States or other countries. They look as though they're trying to insert some proxies on the Kurdish side, maybe other ethnic groups. But I think President Trump has launched this war, which was not necessary. It's an opportunity that he's seized, and he's causing a lot of damage on the Iranian side. I think it's unlikely myself that he'll succeed in toppling the regime, but he will succeed in weakening it. And I think the lesson from Iraq is that if you want to topple a regime, you've got to have armed forces on the ground. And if you put armed forces on the ground, you've got to be prepared for a long slog. It took us basically 20 years after 2003 to help Iraq back on its feet again. It's now actually a much better place than it was 20 years ago, but a huge amount of suffering and death has been incurred in the interim.
And John, when you allow, I say you, I mean the Prime Minister, when the Prime Minister allows British bases in the Gulf to be used by America for offensive operations, is it in any way inevitable that British forces end up on offensive operations?
Well, my understanding is that the Prime Minister has said these are not for offensive operations, therefore defensive operations, although it's a fairly broad description of what amounts to defensive operations. I think our forces are now engaged. We're sending RAF planes as part of the joint UK-Qatari air squadron out to Doha. We've got our forces obviously involved in Cyprus. But I think they'll be careful. They'll be careful not to get involved in activities over Iran itself, and be careful not to be a part of what Keir Starmer, I think, still sees as a conflict of questionable legality.
Okay, now, I'm very keen, I'm very keen to have our listeners join in this conversation. We've heard from a listener who is, retired Lieutenant Colonel Johnny Gray. He was a former commander of the Argyll Regiment, and he was worried about the British military leadership, as he sees it, pulling its punches in the Iran conflict. Have a listen.
I come at this from the perspective of commanding British soldiers in Iraq in 2004. And what was interesting to me at that time, it was becoming very obvious that the Iranian regime were getting involved in that conflict. And the British government under Tony Blair in 2005 accused the IRGC of direct involvement in killing 8 British soldiers. And over time, over the following years, it was clear, I think, to everybody that the Iranian regime had killed scores of British soldiers through their proxies, the Mahdi Army and others in Iraq at the time. So when you hear the government saying, well, there was no legal basis for allowing the Americans to use their bases on British soil, I just find that, frankly, incomprehensible. The IRGC has directly killed scores of British soldiers. We've heard this week about 20 plots to attack the UK currently, and it seems incomprehensible that whilst, I think it's probably right we didn't get involved, not because of the legality aspect, but perhaps because the American plans were at the time certainly pretty incoherent. But the idea we shouldn't allow our allies to use their bases when Iran has done this damage to us and is currently seeking to damage us, I just find that unbelievable.
So, I mean, one of your worries, one of your complaints, as it were, is that the British military is not engaging against some of those Iranian proxies, which have done so much harm to British forces in the past. What kind of operations would you envisage, and where?
Well, I think the other thing is that the Iranians had telegraphed that they would respond with all their means against the allies. We are regarded as little Satan by them. So whether we were involved or not, it was very obvious to anybody with basic military understanding or geopolitical understanding that we would be very quickly targeted by Iran, and that indeed turned out to be the case with attacks on Cyprus and Bahrain, and now their attempts to close the Straits of Hormuz. So it is difficult to understand, and I've been out of the military for some time, but it's difficult to understand why, given the long build-up of American forces, we ourselves had not built up our forces, our Type 45 destroyers, our Navy presence in the Straits of Hormuz, and so on, to protect our interests. And it seems scandalous that we're in this position now.
So that's Colonel Johnny Gray, former commanding officer of the Argylls, and John Sawyer, former director of MI6. I wonder if you would just take that on for a moment. There was an Iraq veteran. It rankled with Colonel Gray that the British forces were not engaging the proxies of Iran. He wants to see a deeper engagement where Iran itself is concerned and its offensive capability. But he's particularly concerned, angry, if you like, about not going after those proxies who've killed so many British soldiers. What would you say to him?
Well, I agree with his description of the damage and the deaths and injuries that Iran and its proxies have caused to British soldiers over the years. And I was in Iraq too at a very early stage after Saddam's fall, and I saw the insurgency there growing, and much of it was stimulated by the Iranians. Now, the question is not, are we seeking revenge for dead British soldiers? I can understand the emotion behind that, but that's not the question that's being posed here. The question is being posed is, how do you deal with Iran and its terrible, awful regime, which is brutal to its own people and which threatens its neighbors? Now, should you deal with it by trying to overthrow the regime and to bombard it from the air, or should you be trying to contain the threat that comes from the regime? And I think all soldiers are keen to be confident that when they're sent on operations, there's a firm legal basis for them to do so. I remember that in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq invasion. However controversial it was, the military were insistent that they would, of course, do it, but there had to be a strong legal base. And the chairman of the Chief of Defence Staff at the time, Admiral Boyce, was very clear with the Prime Minister about that. So I think having a clear legal basis is important. Having a clear strategy is important. I'm afraid revenge is not a strategy.
All right, John Sawyers, thank you for coming on. Thank you for joining us here on the programme. And our guest now joined by Ambassador John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump. Ambassador, welcome as always.
Glad to be with you.
It's good to have you here. You have been, Ambassador, haven't you, a long-term advocate of action against Iran. Are you content at all with how the administration under President Trump is conducting this now?
Look, I think the objective is clear. The case is strong. I've believed this for over 2 decades. I am worried about the way it is materializing. I'm not worried on the military side. I think we've seen conduct of excellent operations, very well planned, obviously a lot more coming. I'm more worried on the political and diplomatic side. I'm worried that the president did not prepare the American public for months in advance, not by talking about the specifics of the operation, obviously, but by making the case for regime change and justifying the potential use of military force. I'm worried that he didn't make an adequate case to Congress, although he defeated one restraining resolution under the War Powers Act the other day, will defeat another one today. Nonetheless, Congress is still not completely understanding of what's been undertaken. I don't think we consulted adequately with allies. I think that's part of the reason we're having trouble with the United Kingdom, among others. And perhaps most important of all, I'm worried that we haven't fully coordinated and cooperated with the Iranian opposition, because they will have, by definition, a major role in the fall of the Ayatollahs and their ultimate replacement with a new regime. So I don't think 5 or 6 days in you can draw any conclusions, but I am worried that the political case here has not been made as effectively, and indeed the overall strategy is not as effective as it could be, notwithstanding the military successes.
Well, interesting points, which perhaps we can come back to in the time that we've got. Catherine Philp, World Affairs Editor at The Times, is here. Catherine.
Hi, John. I'm interested to know what you think about the kind of shifting objectives that have been expressed by the administration for this operation, and whether you're concerned that about Israel's role in potentially pushing Donald Trump into this, and whether Israel has different objectives that maybe are as much about regime collapse as they are about regime change, that an Iran that is in chaos could suit Israel quite well because it wouldn't be able to threaten the region. But that is possibly not good for, well, it's definitely not good for Iran. It's possibly not the American objective either. So do you have an issue with that tension?
Well, I'd like to find anybody who thinks I've been insufficiently critical of Donald Trump, but even I don't think Trump is that gullible. I think he and Netanyahu have coordinated on this very effectively. I think you can see that being played out in the military side of things. And Trump himself was the one who said the objective was regime change. The shifting motives that you're hearing is because of the fracture of the Trump MAGA base. The MAGA isolationists are deeply disturbed by what he's done in Iran, deeply disturbed. And the number one subversive MAGA isolationist is the vice president, J.D. Vance. So they're desperately trying to avoid using words like war of choice, regime change, and so on, so that the anti-Semitic isolationist side of the MAGA movement doesn't criticize them and add to their political problems. In terms of overall U.S. objectives, the very fact that we have been so intimately involved with Israel, for example, in the attack on the Supreme Leader's compound that killed him and many others, shows without question that regime change is the joint objective of the coalition.
Manveen Rana.
John, this is almost a more personal question, I suppose. It does feel like Donald Trump, when he arrived, sort of cleaved the Republican Party. You have the old school Republicans, which I hope you'd be proud to be a member of. The neocons, the people who sort of see America with its alliances, with its position in the world, strong on defence, versus the MAGA base, which actually got Donald Trump elected. Is this the moment where there's a bit of a realignment? Because Iran is the war that most neocons have always wanted to fight. This is unfinished business with the axis of evil. I've never met an American general who doesn't like that. We heard a moment ago from a British soldier who remembers what happened in southern Iraq. There is a lot of old enmity. As you said yourself, this is a war you've sort of been encouraging for 2 decades. Is this the moment where different parts of the Republican Party are looking at the president and having to reevaluate?
Look, I am not a neoconservative. I was for Barry Goldwater in 1964. I've been a conservative longer than
I wouldn't cast you as one of those, but an old school Republican.
Yeah, well, I'm a conservative before I'm a Republican, and I think that part of the MAGA base will follow Trump no matter what he does. If tomorrow he declared victory in Iran and said, "I'm calling everybody home," they'd applaud that too. We'll see. I think there's going to be a fight for the soul of the Republican Party when Trump leaves office, or looking at the 2028 nomination, between the isolationists and those who really understand what Ronald Reagan talked about when he referred to peace through strength. But I think it's really quite important that Trump has done this, because I think it undercuts the isolationists. I'd like to see, in building up public support, I'd like to see Vice President J.D. Vance make an ad with the following statement: "I strongly support Donald Trump's effort to change the regime in Iran through the use of military force. This is J.D. Vance, and I approve this message." See how that does for him.
Ambassador, you said at the outset just a moment ago you were not happy with the messaging of the government in support of this operation, of this war. I'd just like to hear a little more of your thoughts on that. And this was Pete Hegseth, the US Secretary of Defense, or styled in Washington the Secretary of War, talking at a news conference earlier on. He had this to say about the operation.
B-2s, B-52s, B-1s, Predator drones, fighters, controlling the skies, picking targets. Death and destruction from the sky, all day long. We're playing for keeps.
So that was the Defense Secretary talking about, well, death and destruction as almost an end in itself when it comes to this operation. Is that kind of tone, is that helpful in your judgment when it comes to persuading the people of America, Ambassador?
As a child, he's not competent to be Secretary of Defense. I would rather listen to General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who is conducting himself in a very professional military way. And I think he's laying out what they're doing very clearly.
All right, a clear answer to that. A line, if I may, which is just breaking as we speak out of Washington, and it's this, that Kristi Noem, the Homeland Security Secretary, has been sacked. Now, we have no formal detail of that, but we can assume it's in the aftermath of the rolling controversies about the role of Kristi Noem in the border protection, the crackdown on immigration, the rounding up and so on of migrants, which has caused, well, so much controversy and so much of a backlash against the administration. Other things too, questions about her personal life have been wound into all of this. But just as an American with a deep personal interest in this, I wonder what you make of that news, the sacking of Kristi Noem.
Well, that's enormously good news. She was totally incompetent. She didn't know what she was doing in the job. She wasn't really running the department. Stephen Miller in the White House was. So people have been wondering when Trump was going to start taking the garbage out in his administration, and I think it's now happening.
And we have a further line, literally, as you make that point, Ambassador. Mark Wayne Millen has been appointed as the new Homeland Security Secretary. As an outsider looking in, I'm not familiar with the background of Mark Wayne Millen. I wonder if you are.
Yeah, well, he comes from a business background. I think he would take that approach in trying to manage the huge operations of the Homeland Security Department. He's been a Trump loyalist. That's always critical. But I have to say, it now leaves another vacancy in the Republican ranks in the U.S. Senate. Oklahoma has a Republican governor. I'm sure they're going to appoint another Republican. But this is the last time I think that the president should be taking people out of the Senate and the House to move into his administration.
Okay, Ambassador, you have just a moment ago described the Defense Secretary, the War Secretary, as a child. We now have the Homeland Security Secretary being sacked. And I think I detect in your voice some hope, tell me if I'm wrong, that you may see something of what you might term a growing up process in the administration. Would that be fair?
Well, I don't think Trump is fit to be president, so it's going to take a lot of growing up, but every little bit counts.
Well, Ambassador John Bolton, really good to have you with us this evening. And that does end our discussion, our programme for this evening. Huge thanks to Catherine Philp, World Affairs Editor, and to Manveen Rana, and to you for listening and chipping in your questions. I'm John Pienaar. Kate's up next, and you're listening to Times Radio.